from a rural area and being a pretty pragmatic business person, I have been very concerned about the escalating deficits and feel that probably that's the most dangerous thing for the survival of America as we know it today and our economy. And wonder what some economists, some at the University of Illinois, which are in my district, say, well, our deficits aren't too large for our gross national product. I happen to believe they are, and wonder what your thought would be on the long-range effect of continued deficits.
I do not believe that the real problem is, I don't agree with you at all. Because the real problem is not the debt, but government spending. It's government spending which creates the debt that's the real problem, not the debt itself. Let me see if I can put this in a very simple way. There's a certain total amount of resources that the United States has available to it. Call it 100. If government spends 50, only 50 is available for private enterprise to use or private individuals to use for consumption and production and saving, investment. Now, so far, I haven't said a word about how this 50 is financed. Whether this 50 is financed 100% by what we call taxes or 100% by what we call borrowing, it's still true that the amount available to the private system is only half of the total. And so it's this part that government spends that uses resources.
Isn't there some benefit to having the government steal our money, which is what they do effectively? They'll hold a gun to our head and say, pay us 40% of your income or go to jail. They take this money and they give it mostly to government employees. Well, the government employees spend it. The marginal propensity to consume is pretty high. So the people who were robbed have to do something creative to get the money back. And isn't this creative activity the real wealth?
Well, I take it that they would have to be still more creative if 98% were being spent by the government. No, the third part of your thing is just pure fallacy from beginning to end. Because if those people who are now government employees were employed in creative activity and productive activity, they would also be spending their money. And we'd have a greater total around. All you're doing, let's suppose for a moment, take the extreme case, that 40% is being used just to have people sit around. The fact that they spend their money doesn't alter the situation. The only product there is what the 60% produce. And that 60% is divided among the 100%. If those 40% are also producing goods, then there are more goods to go around among everybody. You are just involved in a fallacy of looking at dollars, which is important sometimes, instead of looking at the real product, the goods and services that people produce and people consume. Spending isn't good. What's good is producing. What we want to have is more goods and services. And as I say, the obvious indication that that's clear is that if your logic were right, it would apply it for 50%, 60%, 70, 90, 98, 100%. And obviously you would see that that would be a bunch of nonsense at that stage. It is desirable to have some money spent by government for those things, those services that we believe we can get more usefully and more effectively through government. If people are getting their money's worth, fine. That's why it's very desirable to have governmental expenditures take place at as local a level as possible. Because you, as a citizen of a small community, can judge whether you're getting your money's worth. You can decide that you want to spend it. But when it comes to the federal government, you tend to think that you're spending somebody else's money. And you are in a way. But he's spending yours.
So this video is on the crowding out effect as part of fiscal policy, and the crowding out effect is an economic theory arguing that rising public sector spending drives down or even eliminates private sector spending. So in other words, it creates an opportunity cost of private sector investment. So we saw two interviews with Milton Friedman, and Milton Friedman has spoken about the crowding out effect. But the crowding out effect has been used to consider a range of arguments as to why the government should reduce their spending. Some of those arguments we saw in those interviews. So some economists refer to the crowding out effect as providing a good or service that otherwise the private sector could have offered. Now, the private sector could have offered it in terms of better quality, maybe better price. They could have produced it at a more effective and efficient rate. Or even it relates to factors of production employed by the government, which now logically can't be employed by the private sector. And the question is, would those workers be more productive in the private sector or more creative in the private sector than they are in the public sector? Now, another point that we have to consider is, well, how is this government spending being funded? So government borrowing, for example, increases the competition for private sector saving and thereby pushing up the interest rates. And that's something else that we'll look at within this video. Now, it's also worth pointing out that the crowding out effect usually refers to when the economy is operating at full capacity. So, one way you could draw the crowding out effect as part of a diagram is via a PPF. So as we can see from the PPF, which of course shows that opportunity cost due to limited resources, if we have limited resources of funds and the government has opted to increase their spending from, for example, A to B, then it'll come at an opportunity cost of private sector spending. The argument is, who would you prefer to be spending? The government or the private sector? So, this is another diagram that we can look at. So if we consider how the government is going to fund their spending, if they do it, for example, via taxes, then this means a greater marginal propensity to withdraw of households and firms due to more of their disposable income and their profits going to the government. Now, this could have been spent on consumption and investment, so that's one thought about the crowding out effect. But secondly, if it's being funded by borrowing, then there are only so many loanable funds available. So how does the government plan on attracting and sourcing this finance? Now, to do so, it's going to push up interest rates. So, for example, on coupons on their bonds being issued. And that's to attract, obviously, the sourcing of these loanable funds. Because again, there's only so many loanable funds available. And to get them away from the private sector, you're going to have to obviously attract and try and get those loanable funds towards the government and the public sector instead. Now, if the private sector wants to source this, they'll have to compete now on those interest rates, making it more expensive to do so and mean they're going to be likely to miss out on such funds, restricting their ability to privately spend, as we can see from the market equilibrium in terms of what the government is offering and what the private sector now has to compete with. And as we can see, that means that the private sector spending is going to fall. Now, there's been many examples of wasteful government spending, and the argument of whether it should have been completely left to the private sector to allocate such resources. Because that's the main point. Who is going to be the most effective at generating actual and trend rate growth? Is it going to be the government or is it going to be the private sector? If it's the private sector and they're going to be, for example, much more dynamic with their spending and it's going to help the productive potential of the economy increase, then surely we should leave it to the private sector. So I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of where the government has been wasteful.
Visiting the British Aircraft Corporation factory at Filton near Bristol, the Queen was to see for herself how the Anglo-French Concorde project was shaping, to the delight of the crowd. But it was during her tour the news came that increased costs for developing the 1,500-mile-an-hour jetliner had rocketed to an estimated £500 million. Now, while Her Majesty was showing keen interest in the work, Parliament was expressing concern at the project's soaring expense.
Concorde had cost 5 times its original budget.
Test and Trace was originally given £22 billion for this year. Then, in last week's budget, Rishi Sunak added another £15 billion, taking its total budget to £37 billion over 2 years, as some former senior civil servants say, is vast.
That's about the same amount of money that we spend on our entire public safety system. So that's the police, the criminal courts, the prisons. That's what you buy for £37 billion.
That money bought all those tests, but also consultants paid £1,000 a day. and a contact tracing app that's been used for more than 100 million check-ins. But, we revealed last week, only 287 then new alerts.
The real burden we're imposing on future generations is from spending, not from the debt. And why? Because, go back, if 50% is being spent by government, only 50% is left to be used for capital formation or for consumption. Suppose government were spending 40%. Then you would get larger savings and more capital formation, and that would produce a higher income for our children and grandchildren in the future. So it's spending that has all the bad effects that are attributed to the debt, not the debt per se.